Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us. We are just waiting for one of our VIPs to join. We'll start momentarily. Thank you for your patience.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Keith. It's good to see you. Perhaps we can kick off the program, and welcome.
Yes, thank you. My profound apologies. Bad connection problems this morning here.
That does happen in this unprecedented times. Okay, so welcome. I think we have PS Media, so we can kick off.
All right, very good.
Principal Secretary, sorry, Keith?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Principal Secretary of the National Treasury, Dr. Julius Muya, World Bank Country Director for Kenya, Keith Hansen, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the launch of the Kenya Economic Update Edition 22. The Kenya Economic Update is an biannual flagship publication of the World Bank. It explores Kenya's economic performance and offers policy options. My name is Vera Rosauer with the World Bank, and I will be your host for today. We are streaming live on YouTube. For those watching via WebEx, please use the chat function to post your questions. Do keep it concise. You can also post your brief questions and comments on our Twitter handle at World Bank Kenya. I repeat, our Twitter handle for today is World Bank Kenya, and our hashtag is Kenya Economic Update. You can also follow us on World Bank Kenya Facebook page. To all our esteemed guests, please mute your microphone until it is your turn to speak. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to play out globally and in Kenya. Around the world, many major economies have been affected by renewed waves of COVID-19 infections and deaths. Kenya's economy has not been spared, but swift policy responses and a gradual reopening have supported some subsequent recovery. How then has the economic impact of the pandemic evolved in Kenya since April 2020? Please join me in welcoming the World Bank Country Director for Kenya, Mr. Keith Hansen, to make the opening remarks and to contextualize our conversation here today. Keith, over to you. Keith, I hope you can hear us. Vincent, I think we might have lost Keith. Perhaps if you can sort him out. Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us. We are trying to reconnect our country director.
Hello, can you hear me now? Hello?
Hi, Keith.
Hello, Keith, please go ahead.
Yes, all right, let's try this again. My apologies. I'm not sure what's happening. So good afternoon, everybody, and especially to our distinguished guest, Principal Secretary of the National Treasury, Dr. Julius Muya, and ladies and gentlemen, my apologies for all these connection difficulties. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or this morning if you're in Washington for this web-based virtual launch of our latest Kenya Economic Update. navigating the pandemic. My name is Keith Hansen. I am the new country director for Kenya, and I am honored to be assuming this position where we very much hope to continue to strengthen the partnership between the World Bank and the government and people of Kenya to advance the government's very ambitious development agenda, and of course to help it weather these very difficult times that the coronavirus pandemic has put on us. As many of you will be aware, the KEU, as we call it, is a flagship product of the bank's Kenya country team. We publish it twice a year to provide an overview of recent economic developments and outlook, complemented by Hello, you still hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Everything is perfect. We can hear you.
Yeah, it's fine. All right. So this is twice a year published to provide an overview of recent economic developments as well as the outlook, complemented by a topical feature relating to our twin mandate of poverty reduction and shared prosperity in Kenya. This edition, of course, focuses, as it must, very much on how the economy has been affected by the coronavirus pandemic and the outlook as the pandemic begins to unfold globally and in the country. So in the special topic, we drill down further to present evidence on how households and firms have been affected. This report has a strong focus on suggestions regarding policies to continue to help firms and families to cope, as well as how to support a resilient recovery. This year, because of COVID-19, the entire global economy has experienced an unprecedented shock, a global downturn all around the world. In the previous major global crisis, the global financial crisis of 2008 to 9, developing economies as a whole actually still managed to record positive growth on an annual basis. Fortunately, that is not going to be the case this year. In the face of the pandemic, the whole world, including developing countries, are experiencing a severe recession. The consequences of this are dire. Global extreme poverty is expected to rise in 2020 for the first time in over 20 years. The pandemic is going to push an additional 88 to 115 million people into extreme poverty this year, with the total rising to perhaps as many as 150 million by 2021, depending on the ultimate severity of the economic contraction. Kenya, obviously, has been hugely affected by this. The economy has been exposed through the dampening effects on domestic activity of the containment measures, and of course by people changing their behavior to avoid getting sick. Trade and travel disruption has affected key sectors for jobs and foreign exchange earnings, such as tourism and cut flowers. And although the economy was growing at a robust pace, around 5% before COVID, as the crisis took hold, output contracted very sharply in the second quarter by about 5.7% on a year-on-year basis. It's obviously a very difficult time to make economic projections right now because the unprecedented effects of the pandemic are making this very challenging. But what is clear already is that the economy has significantly slowed down. Our base case now is that 2020 will likely show a small contraction in overall GDP. Such a sharp slowdown is consistent with the lower demand by firms and households, by job losses and pay cuts, and by the disruption to education and health services that we have seen. We commend the government of Kenya for acting very swiftly to contain the pandemic right after the first case was confirmed in mid-March. The strict containment measures, such as closing schools and stopping passenger flights, were complemented by a sizable economic support package, including tax cuts and stepped up spending on health and household income support. These measures undoubtedly saved lives and helped to cushion negative economic impact of the pandemic. However, while they were necessary, these measures obviously inevitably slowed down the economy and, of course, imposed high fiscal costs. Public finances were already stretched going into the crisis, and they have been further stretched by the crisis. Kenya's tight fiscal constraints place a premium on ensuring that government spending is as well targeted and as effective as possible now to support the most vulnerable and to create a platform for recovery. The report discusses many ideas that can help, such as streamlining the public investment portfolio and redirecting spending to sustain and expand support to household incomes. As the economic conditions normalize, returning to a fiscal consolidation path will be critical to contain debt sustainability risks and to underpin a sustainable recovery. The World Bank remains committed to continuing to support the government in this regard. The KEU we are launching today is one element of our support to Kenya through contributing to public information on the economy and evidence and ideas to contribute to the debate on public policies and priorities. So once again, on behalf of the World Bank, thank you to all of you for your virtual participation in this event. And we look forward to an informative and stimulating session, including through the intervention of our special and honored guest, the PSNT. So good afternoon to everyone.
Thank you very much, Keith. I'd like to now welcome the Principal Secretary of the National Treasury, Dr. Julius Muller.
I thank you all. Thank you for this opportunity. Good afternoon to those who are joining from this part of the world. Good morning. Those are joining from the US. I hope that in these very unusual times, everyone is keeping safe and doing well. So for me, it is a great pleasure to join you this afternoon and to be part of the launch of yet another Kenya economic update that Keith has described so very well. So as we have noticed, this update continues to do several things for us. Firstly, it provides unbiased and candid assessment of the performance of the Kenyan economy. And secondly, we observe that it highlights emerging challenges which keep on showing up in the horizon. And then thirdly, it provides a suitable platform for stimulating dialogue on potential policy responses like we are doing this afternoon. So let me point out that over the years, this Kenya Economic Update report has a wide audience. And I can see from my screen that we are quite a number, almost 100. And it has also continued to contribute immensely to the policy-making process in our country. So we want to thank the World Bank actually for this. So I note that this edition, number 22, is rightly titled Navigating the Pandemic, which does recognize both the gravity of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are still facing, but also the opportunities that we can also seize on for an inclusive and resilient recovery. A special focus on this topic presents in greater detail the socioeconomic impact of COVID, both on households and business firms. And so my remarks would mainly highlight on some of these challenges and what our President Uhuru Kenyatta tries to do and keeps on reminding us in his government what we are doing to address things to do with restoring and sustaining the economy so that we can have inclusive growth post-COVID. Now, it is now widely acknowledged that COVID-19 is first and foremost a very severe human tragedy, which has caused tremendous suffering for people globally and in Kenya as well. But it is also an economic crisis because we are seeing what we would call hard-won gains in the past, like economic growth, like poverty reduction, and many other areas, which gains are being washed away by the impact of this pandemic. The crisis, needless to say, is leading to several challenges. Let me just pick 3 out of the very many challenges that we are facing. Number one, and the direct challenge, is on the healthcare system, where we have a stretched healthcare system. And in Kenya, we observed that from mid-September this year through to November, we have been witnessing what we would call a renewed wave of COVID-19 infections. So while the number of cases and deaths has so far been lower than what we feared initially, we have concerns that remain regarding the high positivity rates that we've recorded, and also the consequence of stretched healthcare system, whose capacity to cope is being challenged. So let me take this opportunity to encourage the fellow Kenyans to observe the government's guidelines and the protocols that we have been issuing time and again concerning how to deal with COVID-19. Now, the second major challenge is economic growth that has been severely impacted, and also the per capita income, which is expected to contract. So we are projecting an economic growth at about 0.6% in the calendar year 2020. And this is well below Kenya's growth potential of around 6% per year. Also, per capita GDP may contract for the first time since 2008, that is over 12 years ago. Now, despite the second quarter trough in which the economy contracted by 5.7%, we are pleased to note that growth is gradually picking up. However, the negative side, overall aggregate demand remains weak, with subsectors that require more physical contact to operate being hit most, where they show particular vulnerability. As such, sectors include the hotel industry, restaurants, and education, which have suffered a lot in the last few months. It is also the case, therefore, that this situation has hampered the government's progress towards creating jobs, towards reducing poverty, and also our drive to attain our Big Four development agenda. Now, the third challenge is the fiscal stance, where our earlier planned fiscal consolidation path has had to be postponed because of the realities of softening revenues and also increased expenditures. And so, with weaker than anticipated growth and also deteriorated business environment amid rising demand for health and social protection expenditures, the Kenya's fiscal deficit has widened to 8.2% of GDP, and this compares to a budget target of 6.3% of GDP, and this is for the year ending June 2020. Now, looking ahead, we are projecting that the deficit will expand slightly further to 8.9% of GDP in the year 2020-2021. Now, let me also state that much of the funding has been through domestic borrowing, which of course has its problems of crowding out the private sector. But I'm happy to say that we've also increased our uptake of concessional financing, as we have been trying as much as possible to wean ourselves from expensive external financing sources. So I also want to thank World Bank and the IMF because they have been very helpful in helping us to access this concessional financing. Now, notwithstanding the challenges that I've indicated above and others that I've not mentioned, the Kenya government has been equal to the task and has responded swiftly to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. One of the key actions has been concerted stepping up of spending on the health sector, and this has been targeted at strengthening the healthcare capacity. We've also been very focused in putting in place a variety of containment measures. These have been geared towards delaying the spread of the virus and also geared to allow the health system to cope and ultimately allowing resumption of economic activities. And this is from mid-August 2020. We continue to commend courageous efforts of Kenya's medical professionals who have diligently been in the forefront of this battle. Specifically, the government has also undertaken the following in order to deal with this crisis. The first thing we did was to come up with a supplementary budget for the year 2019-2020. And this was around April, where we were focusing on the health and social protection. This budget allocated additional spending to strengthen the health system, to protect the vulnerable households, and also ease business firms' liquidity constraints. And this was significantly estimated at about 0.4% of GDP. It is clear that these interventions have significantly helped the health sector, as well as the most vulnerable households and business firms to cope through this crisis. Now, another action that we took was to structure, propose, and implement a fiscal stimulus to support jobs and recovery of the economic activities. And therefore, during the financial year 2020-2021 budget, starting with 1st of July, the government set aside about 0.5% of GDP, which in Kenya shillings is 54 billion Kenya shillings, for the Economic Stimulus Program, ESP. These funds were allocated to high-impact, labor-intensive activities. One of them, which is very, very popular, is what we call Kazi Mtaani. That is a Swahili word meaning work on the street. And this is youth work programs where youth do a lot of work and they are paid for the work that they do. Making of school desks, environmental and water sanitation, and other areas, including public infrastructure. We're also supporting agriculture, tourism, and also looking to support people who have become vulnerable because of the pandemic. And so social protection was another target. We also focus on providing tax relief. And so from April 2020, the government implemented full income tax relief for persons earning a gross monthly income of up to Kenya shillings 24,000. Also, we provided lower taxes where there was a reduction of corporate and top individual income tax rate. We call it pay as you earn in Kenya, from 30% to 25%. We also reduced the turnover tax rate from 3% to 1%. And also we focused on VAT and reduced VAT rate from 16% to 14%. And so these measures were meant to support business firms' liquidity and alleviate cash flow challenges as a result of disrupted demand and economic activity. Obviously, those which were aimed at individuals were aimed at putting some money in their pockets. And we also focused on monetary policy, and in our monetary policy response, additional monetary stimulus and liquidity support was provided by the Central Bank of Kenya, including a reduction of the policy rate, which we call CBR, to 7% from 8.25%, further reduction of the cash reserve ratio from 4.25% to 4.25% from 5.25%, and also the central bank granted flexibility to commercial banks in their provisioning requirements for loans and enabled them also to restructure loans that were not performing due to the pandemic. Now, finally, one other response that we would like to share is on financial sector policies. And in here, we focus on extending flexibility to borrowers on loan terms based on individual circumstances arising from the pandemic, and also setting fees for mobile money transactions for amounts less than 1,000 at nil, that is zero. And this was encouraged to incentivize use of cash. We also did structure a credit guarantee scheme to support MSMEs lending, which already the government has provided seed capital of Kenya shillings 3 billion and we expect this to grow to 10 billion. And I think in the next 2 weeks or so, we should be launching this credit guarantee scheme. The government does intend, in this respect, to work with other partners, including the National Development Finance institutions and the private sector, to mobilize additional capital, that we can have a robust, vibrant credit guarantee scheme to provide credit and finance to businesses, because indeed businesses and the private sector are the engine of development. Now, finally, like all governments around the world, the Kenya authorities face a difficult task due to the uncertainties to minimize loss of life and livelihoods in the face of the adversity. And Keith has mentioned this about the difficulty in planning at this stage, because focusing and predicting and projecting the future is not easy now. We do appreciate the continued solid engagement and partnership with the World Bank to the Kenya people in supporting efforts that are aimed at addressing the current crisis and also containing the spread of the pandemic. Today's launch of the 22nd edition of the Kenya Economic Update is an important milestone because it allows us to take a step back in assessing where we are 9 months since the COVID-19 virus was first diagnosed in Kenya. This reflection obviously offers us a golden opportunity to deliberate on the way forward. Now, my last comment is just a way of coincidence that today we are also looking to finalize the draft government's economic recovery strategy through a lot of consultations. And in this, we are looking to reflect on the ambition of our government to build back better, a strong and a vibrant post-COVID Kenya economy. I encourage all of us to familiarize ourselves with this economic recovery strategy and also use the information that is going to be shared, this Kenya Economic Update document that is going to be launched today. I want to say thank you very much for listening to me. And in this part of the world, we say Asante Sana.
Asante Sana, Dr. Julius Munya, and thanks again for those valuable insights. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kenya Economic Update was co-authored by Alex Sinnott, Peter Chacha, and Itzka. I now invite Alex Sinnott to walk us through the macro part of the report. The special focus section of the report on the impacts of the pandemic on businesses and households will be covered by Itzka. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Vera, PS, NT, Keith, everyone attending this session. Thank you so much for joining and participating in this launch of our report. And it's a very great pleasure on my part and privilege to present to you on the first part of the report, as Vera said. So I'm sharing my screen. I hope someone will shout if indeed that does not work. And I will take a maximum of 15 minutes. I'm going to give myself a very hard limit and then hand over to Utz. So as the PS rightly said, this report, spends some time just taking stock of where we are. A really major set of data that we got since the last report we published back in April was, of course, the Q2 national accounts. They're very important for informing our understanding of what's been happening and where we are heading. So this chart begins by showing the picture that we get looking at those latest national statistics, and we can see, the economy was growing really robustly up until the first quarter. Then we had the full impact of the global COVID crisis, which began here in Kenya sort of mid-March and especially moving into Q2. And as was noted, we saw this sharp contraction in Q2 of minus 5.7%. If we decompose it a bit, we can see that the primary sector, which is really agriculture, continued to be quite robust. That was certainly very helpful if we consider how many livelihoods in Kenya depend on that. But we saw a small contraction in secondary and manufacturing and a very large contraction in the services sector. So much of services involves interaction and was very vulnerable to the measures and the behavior changes that had to happen. So if we unpack in this next slide what happened in the services sector, where did this big contraction really come from? Well, a few places. Wholesale and retail trade contracted a bit. Accommodation and food, this is basically tourism and hospitality, contracted quite significantly, as one would expect. Transport and storage too. But the really big purple one, you can see at the bottom, is education, where real output contracted by almost 60% year on year in the second quarter. Now, this represents KNBS's best efforts to understand, what was the impact of the school and other institution closures on education outputs. So the inputs to the sector may not have changed very much, but it's reasonable, to have expected that there was a big change in how much education was really going on, in a sense. And we've had this estimate of a very large impact. I will touch on this again because it's very important to explaining our projections. In terms of moving further into the year, the second half of the year, Q3, and the PS alluded to this as well, we've actually had a fair amount of data now that shows quite a pronounced reopening of the economy. Government took some measures along these lines. The reopening of international travel in August is one example. And so we can see, if we look, for example, at this mobility data, that we had a clear trough in the most intense phase of the crisis around April and May, and then this significant and sustained sort of trend recovery in terms of a normalization of activity that is associated with what we see in terms of the economy and earning incomes and people being able to work. So if you look at grocery and pharmacy, for example, we were almost back. In fact, we were back to sort of normal levels at the start of this month, at the end of October, and not too dissimilar across much of the rest of the areas where we have data. And that links up quite well to what we see in other high frequency data. These are just two examples: electricity consumption in terms of KPLC sales, and the Purchasing Managers Index, which gives us a sense of the extent to which orders and outputs are growing. And you can see the same, very similar pattern: steep decline, but then a very pronounced bounce back as we moved further into this half of the year. In terms of other things that, of course, we look at very closely, inflation has seen a very pronounced disinflation dynamic during the course of 2020. So we're now at under 5%, which is essentially the midpoint of the band that CBK, the central bank, targets. And that's certainly consistent with a variety of negative price shocks, notably international energy prices as a result of the global crisis, but also helped by, as I've mentioned, good conditions in agriculture, recovery from the tough situation with the drought in 2019. So all of these things have fed through into a fairly benign picture for consumer prices, and that's enabled CBK to undertake some of the accommodative measures that the PS also rightly mentioned. So if we think about primary economic concerns at the moment, for once in Kenya as well as elsewhere, inflation is not at the top of the list. What about the external balances? Well, here we've seen some compression of the financing need that comes from the balance on Kenya's current account. And this is also quite informative about what's been happening in the economy, because what we've seen is that although exports did fall, imports fell even more. And part of that was energy prices, but part of that was also the more subdued economic activity and investment activity in the economy. And as a result, the yellow component of these bars shrank. That's the structural deficit on the goods trade balance that Kenya runs. And that was kind of a dominant effect in the current account and resulted in a compression of the overall financing need there. But we also saw some other quite encouraging sources of resilience, and that would include what I just wanted to zoom in on here very briefly, which was the resilience of international remittances. They're an important source of foreign exchange in the current account. It's secondary income, and contrary to a lot of fears, actually they've held up rather well. There's been, some moderate decline in the recent months up until October when we have data. But if you look at the level, they've remained quite strong. So that has certainly been helpful, and it's an encouraging sign, of the networks and of the sources of potential continued support that Kenya does have. In terms of the other aspect of the external dynamics that, of course, gets attention, the currency is prominent there, and the shilling, of course, has depreciated quite significantly in 2020 on the order of 8% year to date. But this really needs to be put in context of the region and really across the board of emerging and developing currencies. So if you look at that chart on the left, it puts the shilling's movement against the dollar in sort of regional perspective. And you can see that, the way the shilling has moved is really not at all out of the ordinary in comparison to many of the peers. So it's really been, one could say, a kind of broad-based dollar effect that's been at work. And we should also note that, in fact, in terms of helping the economy adjust to what has obviously been a really major shock, moderate currency depreciation like this can be quite constructive and helpful in terms of supporting the international competitiveness of domestic production. So that's a bit of a race through the most recent economic developments and some of the most salient features there. What does it mean forward-looking? So this slide goes where the angels fear to tread in terms of our GDP growth projections. Even before I put this up, I would just flag, that both the PS and our country director, were quite right to emphasize we continue to be in a period of really elevated uncertainty. So these are, of course, our best estimates, but they're subject to, unusually significant potential for revision and caveats. But the story is as follows. Before the crisis, we were looking at a fairly stable growth picture, tracking quite close to 6%, similar to long-term, the sustainable growth rate that we think the economy does have. Back in April, when we first estimated the impact of what at the time was still kind of the nascent crisis, we projected that GDP growth might dip to about 1.5% this year before rebounding to 5.2% next year. Subsequently, on the basis of the additional data we now have a base case for a contraction of 1% in 2020. And as you can see, in fact, a stronger bounce back to 6.9% in 2021. That projection is importantly influenced by, if you recall my first slide or two when we discussed education, it's linked very strongly to that very powerful effect of the estimated decline in education output this year. That effect alone reduces GDP growth for the year by, we estimate, 2.2%, if you assume that there will be a similar statistical effect from education institutions remaining shut down more or less in Q3, with a bit of an improvement in Q4. So that's really an important driver of why we're seeing the small contraction this year. Next year, on the flip side of that coin, if you like, as we see a normalization in the education sector, there's conversely a big top up to the amount of growth that we would see. And that's why we have such an unusually strong rebound of 6.9%. But we really do need to flag that this is quite dependent on the methodology and any new data that comes along that KNBS will rightly take into account as they make their best estimate of what's been happening in education output and elsewhere in the economy. It's normal for there to be revisions to the national accounts data, but we anticipate that they could be particularly significant at this time for obvious reasons. and that final purple line is just showing GDP excluding the impact of education, and you can see that in that case actually our projections remain quite similar to what they were before. Other forward-looking elements that I just wanted to take a minute or two to discuss, again, have been very amply and rightly touched on by the PS. Of course, the key challenge is the fiscal dynamics. We know that there was an ambitious plan before the crisis hit to undertake a fiscal consolidation. That has been put on pause. That's inevitable when we have a big negative economic shock like we've experienced. And it will continue to be the case in the current fiscal year that there's a very sizable fiscal deficit. The driver of that is essentially more on the revenue side, with revenues having come off a little bit in recent years relative to total output, and of course being affected by both the policy package that government has put in place to respond to the crisis and the weaker economic conditions. So this is a driver of the continuing fiscal picture, and as a result of that, we do see this increasing level of debt in recent years, and that it's not shown on the graph, but that would be projected to continue in the current year. The baseline that we have continues to be that Kenya's debt trajectory is sustainable under a base case where there is a return to fiscal consolidation in the coming years. But you know, conditions being what they are, risks around that are certainly elevated. Where you know there's every reason to return to a focus to bring that down once it's feasible to do that in terms of the economic conditions. And by way of speaking to the importance of the kind of fiscal agenda, we thought this would be an interesting chart to show. This is credit growth year on year, on the one hand to the private sector, the purple line, and on the other hand to government, the orange line. And we can see this very pronounced pickup of credit extension going not so much to private, but rather to governments. That's in response to the very significant financing needs that government, of course, has at this time. But it can just give us this perspective that in Kenya's case now, where there is a significant debt burden, you know, often fiscal consolidations are associated with a kind of austerity, problematic for growth, kind of a crunch time. That's not necessarily the situation for Kenya now, because as government's financing needs come down as a result of fiscal consolidation efforts, that's going to open up, you know, significant new space for this kind of chart to turn around and for credit to flow, you know, much more to the private sector, which will help to support private sector investment and a sustainable, strong economic recovery. I'm going to hand over momentarily to Utz, but our final slide here is just to highlight that the report goes into a considerable amount of detail around ideas for policies that can support. I've just had a little bit of time to skim the economic recovery strategy that the PS mentioned. I think there are many complementarities and overlaps in terms of the intentions. I've spoken a bit about the fiscal, where you know there are ample opportunities to address you know less efficient kinds of spending, to normalize on the tax side, as the president has already indicated, you know, will be the case. And so I would just encourage people to look at the report, and perhaps we also engage later in the conversation and in the Q&A. So thank you so much. Apologies if that was too much too quickly, but I wanted to try and hit my time allocation, and I will now stop sharing and hand over to Utz, who will cover part 2 of the report. Thank you so much for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. I hope someone is telling me so I'm going to share my screen as well. And so Alex very much covered the macro side of the impact of COVID-19. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically discuss a little bit of what we see in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the households. And this, of course, includes poverty, because like the one side is, of course, to think about the firms, But what really matters in the end is how do households cope with the current shock, and what can government and what can others do to basically help households to like recover from the shock. So just to basically set quickly the background, I mean, it has been mentioned quite a bit already by Keith as well as by the PSNT, but just to sort of like show it also like in a graph, I mean, the COVID cases in Kenya started sort of like a little bit later to like significantly grow, much more like in June, July. But as you can see in the lower graph, Kenya was very quick, and that's something that like we do appreciate and think it had like a really helpful impact on the number of cases, was really quick in like enacting containment measures. And so in the lower graph, you can basically see the stringency index, which is provided by Oxford University, and it compares across different countries how much of containment measures they actually have enacted. And you can see Kenya is very much like among the peers. You see very quickly, very strong containment measures. I mean, you can also see like the one outlier, Tanzania, which I think is very much also discussed in the press. But going back to Kenya, you can see that the stringency was quite high, but then like in the summer, it sort of like was relaxed a little bit. And I think this is also all like what we observe also if you go on the streets. Now, what the impact of that is, like the joint impact of COVID-19 itself, as well as the containment measures that, again, were very helpful in like containing the spread of the disease. But what we estimate is that it had a huge impact on poverty. In other words, we estimate that the progress of poverty reduction over the last 5 years was basically wiped out by this shock. And you can see this in this graph. And in numbers, I mean, this is a 4 percentage point increase in the headcount rate, or to sort of like put it like even more plastic, it's like about 2 million additional individuals who are now poor. Again, that's also something Keith mentioned. This is something we've unfortunately seen across the world. Now, like across the world, we are estimating between 88 to like 125 million additional poor, but Kenya is very much part of it, which is no surprise because, well, it had a very similar effect, like impact in terms of like the cases in other countries in Africa, as well as the containment measures that I've just shown in the previous slide. And now what I want to sort of like discuss a little bit is how did this change in poverty really come about? And then, of course, also going to say a few words about what I think what can be done to like mitigate this impact on poverty. So given the containment measures, what we've seen is, and Alex also discussed this a lot in his slides, like a really slowdown of economic activity. And so on this slide, I'll basically show what is the impact on formal firms as well as on household enterprises. Now, a lot of this data that I show you is estimated from some rapid response phone surveys that we are conducting and continuing to do. And I show you some information on this on the last slide. But so if you look at the formal firms and what the impact was from COVID-19 and the containment measures, you can see that about 40% of them either had to partially close or be temporarily closed or being permanently closed. And even the firms that are not closed, and you can see that in the lower graph, they actually saw a huge reduction in sales. So mainly like revenue really went down. And we can all imagine what this happens also for firms and the workers that are working in these firms. Now, this is not only something that we saw for formal firms, we see exactly the same for household enterprises. And I mean, the household enterprises are really important for the informal sector in Kenya, which of course plays a huge role. And so there you can see about 30% of firms were like affected in terms of their operating status, that they had to like temporarily or permanently close. But you can also see the change in sales. And that's exactly sort of like the parallel story to the formal firms, that they really dropped by like about 30%. And that's a huge huge decrease that really matters if you think about operating costs of a firm or operating costs of a household enterprise, and how to continue to basically open and engage in economic activity. And so it's no surprise that therefore we also saw a lot of closures. Now, what does this sort of like picture much more from the demand side of labor? What does it mean for households? And so here we basically look at the employment rates, because obviously the households, they get their livelihoods from work, and the work often takes place either in the formal firms or like in household enterprises or informal firms. And so on the left top graph, we compare the unemployment rates. And you can see there were like around 5% in the previous quarters, but then in May, June, it actually tripled to like 16.5%. Now, let me also like flag here, and Alex mentioned this also a couple of times about the uncertainty. Also, this number, of course, has quite a bit of uncertainty. It's measured by a phone survey rather than sort of like the face-to-face surveys of the numbers from the previous quarters. And of course, also sort of like the questionnaire design is slightly different. And so you will see that there are different unemployment rates around. Some of them, and we have been like mentioned before, is like around 10% of unemployment rates. It depends on exactly what kind of definition you're using and which exact time period you use, because there's a lot of volatility across time. But so rather than really focusing on a 16.5%, the point really is that the unemployment rate really went up, meaning a lot of people lost their work. And very similar to what I've shown you for the firm side, also happens for the earnings of households, of individuals who are working. And you can see this in the lower graph, that basically the earnings really dropped, and that specifically in the informal sector as well as in the service sector. And so here you can see it's a drop between like 20 to 30%. And while in the graph it might not show as sort of like a huge gap, like imagine for yourself if suddenly 20 or 30% of your wage is gone and you don't know when it's going to come back. I mean, this really has an effect of like your livelihood and how you're going to deal with this. And this is something we are showing here. So we also asked households, how are they dealing with basically the deteriorating livelihoods that they see? And this is called coping mechanisms. And so on the left-hand side, we basically rank them according to how often people are using them. And you see a lot of them rely on savings, which is actually a quite positive coping mechanism because it doesn't deteriorate the ability of the household in the future to basically earn money or to have a productive activity. But unfortunately, not all households can rely on savings, because obviously in the first place, you have to have savings to be able to do so. But rather, we see basically a similar number of households who rely on reducing food consumption, meaning they basically eat less. And that's also shown a little bit on the right-hand side, where you see how many days adults and children had to skip meals to basically align the new situation with the new situation of the household in terms of their new earnings. And you can see that, well, like 40% of adults basically, or like 40% of households with adults have have skipped meals over time. And that's like really significant. And you can also see that similarly, this is true for children, a little bit less. This is also something we expect, because often adults are the first ones to sort of skip meals. But if this is not enough, then of course also children have to skip meals. And this has of course huge impacts on like malnutrition and on human capital. And this can really deteriorate over time and into the future the human capital, no? Because for children, we also know that malnutrition leads to like less learning and therefore less human capital, again, as I've said before. And so therefore we call this also a negative coping strategy, which is something that is really risky to see in such a high frequency of like above 40% in a society. The other one I want to flag here is the sales of assets, which also like more than 10% of households did to basically deal with the reduced livelihood. And sales of asset is also very critical, because it can mean that households are forced to sell productive assets. And this also means for them, it's going to be much more difficult in the future to basically go back to the productive activity that they had before. And so rather than sort of like a transient shock that can be resolved over time, if you sell an asset, it might actually mean that in the future, you're not going to be able to like recover to the point where you've been before. And so I've already mentioned human capital a little bit, but I do want to highlight some more impacts on human capital. I mean, we all know that schools were closed. And again, I mean, this was necessary to reduce the risk of infections and the spread of COVID-19. But what are the impacts of that? And how are they different between, for example, rural and urban areas? And so a lot of children started to engage in learning activities at home and remote activities. And you can see this a little bit in the lower graph. So a lot of children would start reading school textbooks at home, reading for pleasure, and so on. But you can see that first, there is a difference between urban and rural. Like urban children tend to engage more in such learning activities than in rural households. On the other side, something that is really important for learning is to have access to a teacher. And there you can see first that even urban households, only 20% of children have access to a teacher. And that's like really little, like 1 out of 5 children. For rural households, it's even less so. And so this basically brings us like 2 main conclusions. The first one is that we really need to make sure that we're not losing human capital for the future. In other words, that we don't deprive children of learning so that they can later engage in like productive activities and productive activities. And the second main message is that it's not just that all children are affected equally, but it's especially rural children who are affected more. And this is also really important because we do know from baseline data before that educational outcomes, especially in rural areas, are less than in urban areas. No, yet less children go to secondary school and of course also to tertiary school. And so we have always seen this discrepancy in learning outcomes between urban and rural. And now what this shock is doing, it's basically exacerbating the disparities. And that's also very worrisome. Now, one final slide sort of like on the results of the survey and to sort of like give you a little bit of a picture of what's happening on the ground with the households. Actually, citizens are quite positive and really continue to trust the government in their response. And I think this is also due to what the PSNT had like mentioned in all the different activities that have been enacted to make sure that first the spread of COVID-19 is contained, but on the other side also to make sure that the economic impacts are not can be like mitigated to some extent. And so you can see that this picture is not that bad, but on the other side, citizens are not completely sure whether the government has the ability to basically provide sufficient assistance to households in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And that's the lower graph or the lower bar in the graph. And this is a very interesting finding, and it also speaks a little bit to the situation. I think it's less sort of like criticism to the government. It's also just acknowledging the difficulty of the situation. And Alex had mentioned it, and of course the PSNT had mentioned it. There is of course the big constraint of the fiscal balance, and so also government doesn't have like infinite funding, and that's something that might restrict the response. So with that, let me move to quickly sort of like the one slide of some policy recommendations or like suggestions, and I've split them into like the firm side and the household side. On the firm side, it is really important to ensure the liquidity of viable firms. So basically, a lot of measures should help to like make sure that this shock remains transient rather than permanent. And so you don't want to have firms which are normally very viable to basically go under and have to close permanently, but you rather want to make sure that they can actually survive. We've also seen that a lot of firms, and the KAU speaks much more to it in much more detail, that a lot of firms started to use digital capabilities, and that the more access to digital capabilities they had, the better they also fared. And so it is important, especially in this kind of crisis, to enhance the digital capabilities because it can really allow a lot of economic activity to continue to take place, even if containment measures have to be adhered to. And finally, it's also improving access to information. And that's as much about access of information of what kind of programs are available as it is about, for example, markets. Because often like firms can much more probe what is, for example, the demand for certain products and for certain services by basically having a shop. Now, with containment measures in place and moving everything to sort of like the more digital space, it's much more difficult sometimes to really measure this demand. And so access to information, to markets, is really important to allow firms to react to the shock and to basically use the digital capabilities of still continuing economic activity. Now, on the household side, I mean, I've mentioned, like one of the main reasons for the deterioration of livelihoods of households is really the loss of work, the loss of livelihoods. And so, as Alex also mentioned, private sector-led growth, as well as, for example, reprioritization of public investment programs by the government, can really help to create jobs or to sustain jobs and also to improve jobs to become so that jobs are like more productive. That's really important. And that's really the more like sustainable path towards recovery. But in addition to that, what we also feel is really as important is to sort of like going with the same mantra I've repeated already before, to like make sure that households do not fall into permanent poverty, but rather that households, even if they become poor for some time now, that once the shock and the containment measures are lifted, that they can automatically or like very quickly jump back to a non-poor status. And that is really important. And so for this, we need to make sure that households have access to food and to livelihoods. And food, especially, I've mentioned this in terms of like its impact on human capital, but also in terms of like generally social protection support. And so we feel that cash transfers are a good tool for that. And I come back to this in a little bit more detail in the next slide. Now, the next 2 points, of course, are also important to ensure access to education and health. And I've mentioned very prominently, the disparity between urban and rural, which needs to be fixed. And there needs to be specific measures to ensure that rural households, rural children have access to proper learning so that they don't lose out in learning for the future. And finally, of course, it's also about improving the communication strategies. And I think the PSNT mentioned this also in his remarks. It is important to continue adopting the preventive behaviors like wearing face masks and other measures. And that's really important to continue to emphasize. Now, cash transfers I had mentioned, and it's also in the part of the economic recovery plan from the government. I just wanted to make the point that 2 different points. The first point is with a cash transfer, one can really help to reduce the impact of COVID-19 on poverty. So basically, you can mitigate this effect. But the second point is one needs to make sure that this measure is targeted well, that it really reaches the households who are in need, rather than being sort of like a universal transfer. So let me quickly talk you through this. So here we are assuming a cash transfer of 50 billion Kenyan shilling, which sounds, of course, like a lot of money, and it is, but it is actually the cost of the VAT relief that was enacted by the government. And as you might know, a VAT relief is not targeted to the poor. It's basically across all the households. And therefore, it usually doesn't show as much of a poverty impact. So now, if you would take this money instead and use for a cash transfer, I'm showing you 2 different options. The first option is using a universal transfer to every individual in Kenya, but then, of course, for a smaller amount because, well, it's a fixed budget of 50 million that I'm assuming. So in such a universal transfer, you would reduce the increase of the poverty rate by 4 percentage points to only 2 percentage points. And that would be really helpful. But on the other side, using exactly the same amount of money, you could also target it well. And on the right-hand side, I show you a map where we simulated which geographical areas are affected most by poverty from before COVID-19 plus the additional impact from COVID-19 at the moment. And those areas, if those ones would be targeted, what you would see is that the same amount of money would basically be able to completely mitigate the negative impact of COVID-19 on poverty. And in addition, even help some additional poor households to actually get out of poverty. And so in the end, you would reduce the poverty headcount rate by 1 percentage point from before COVID-19. And so this really should make the point. It's not only important sort of the overall budget and to engage in a cash transfer, it's really important to target it well so that it can become a very efficient and effective transfer. And one last point I want to make here is that for such a transfer, it is important not to install and establish new ad hoc systems, but that this is enacted as part of the social protection framework and the context and the institutions that Kenya already has. Because Kenya has already a number of different social protection programs, and that it would be really helpful to basically place such a cash transfer within this framework to make sure that existing structures are used. Now, the final word is just for the ones who are curious about how we are monitoring the economy, and also if you are really interested in basically following up such updates much more quickly than in the launch of a Kenyan economic update. So we are actually running this rapid response phone surveys on citizens like households, also including refugees, as well as firms. But especially in the households, we've basically provided this online dashboard, and I give you just 2 different screenshots on the left where you can see the weekly updates, on the right where you can also spatially disaggregate certain indicators and see which parts of the country are most affected. And so this data collection is a joint effort with the Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics, of course, but also with UNHCR and with the University of Berkeley. And so you can go on this website, kenyacovidtracker.org, and then click on the Rapid Response National Sample Surveys, and then you automatically come to this dashboard, or you use this abbreviated URL. And so we are planning to continue these surveys for the next couple of months, as long as basically needed, because we feel such data is really important to basically track the socioeconomic impact of the crisis, to inform government as well as other stakeholders in the country what is happening, and then also see how, for example, an increase or relaxation of containment measures or the enactment of large programs, how this can actually affect households. So let me stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex, Sinach, and Itzhak for sharing with us the fundamentals of the report. We would like to invite the audience to ask questions during the Q&A session, which we are going to flag off momentarily. Please use the chat function below to post your questions or comments. I kindly ask that you do keep them brief. If you're following us on social media, please drop us your comments and your questions via Twitter at World Bank Kenya. I repeat, via Twitter at World Bank Kenya. Or you can also post your question on our Facebook page at World Bank Kenya. Peter Chacha, our senior economist, will now kick off this Q&A session. Peter, over to you.
Many thanks, Vera, and distinguished audience. We're really to have you joining today. And I think one of the best opportunity that KU provide is ability to be able to engage with the audience and to receive questions. So I really encourage you to start formulating your questions. It gives you an opportunity to ask the question to the audience, to the authors, but also to ask some of our VIPs. And here we have the PS as well as our country director connected. So I encourage you to formulate your question. Let me just add three things. I think, the positive news about vaccine does provide great hopes of us all being able to see the sun parting through clouds. And so even though the message within the KU is that the economy has been hit so hard, there is hope in sight, given that I think with the very hard work from the medicinal professionals, they have managed to put forward a vaccine that is likely to start rolling towards mid next year. The second thing I wanted to add is that we for the first time we're engaging and reaching out to the Kenya's diaspora, and we are privileged to be joined by at least three, if not more, in the panel today by Professor Gerono, Laban, as well as Kefa. And I'm going to give them an opportunity, particularly for Laban and Gerono, to come in and just point out, for example, how the Kenya's diaspora, how they're being impacted by COVID, particularly in the US, and how they've been able to show a lot of resilience, as we saw through the presentation. For example, the remittances that Kenya continue to receive from the diaspora is still quite strong, although of course we noted that in the month of April there was a slight dip, but then it did bounce back very quickly. And so it would be nice to hear from particularly Laban on how the Kenya's diaspora has been impacted by COVID and how they have maintained very good and strong relationship with the Kenyans back at home. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chacha. Thank you, Vera, for the invite. Good morning, good afternoon, distinguished guests and panelists. Such a great pleasure to be here. Indeed, this has been a very informative session. My very first time to actually even follow through. I've always stayed away from numbers because my mind orientation is very different being in law. So if I misspeak, just note that it's my ignorance of numbers and economics. But thank you for the invite to speak, especially in regards to the diasporians and how they have been affected, and by extension, perhaps how it has also affected those back in Kenya. Now, I must put a disclaimer that what I'm about to say is not something that has been professionally sampled, but maybe just mere observations from colleagues or people that I come across. Now, I'm glad that you mentioned about the numbers, especially the remittances, which have been sort of also very helpful back at home in terms of supporting the economy. Now, there has been still quite a big impact among Kenyans, and this is really in the US diaspora. I'm not sure about other diasporans, but I think it's been across the board. But overall, I think, well, going with the demographics of Kenyans who are in the US, a big number of them are in, quite a number of them are in professional careers, which may have been not heavily impacted in terms of their income. So we're looking at people who are in the healthcare industry, which of course were impacted in the sense the pandemic hit them hard, but may not have affected them because they were working and therefore still earning income, and therefore obviously able to send money back home. Other people, especially students, and Professor Rotich will will comment a little bit about that because she was heavily involved with students who form a good number of diasporans, especially here in continental US, were very heavily negatively impacted, both nationally in terms of various cities and universities around the country, and then even in local settings within homes where they could be staying with with family members and the like. So depending on the demographics, I think the numbers, the response would be different. Those who had professional careers, I think, may not have been very much impacted, and especially those who were in industries that were not affected in terms of loss of jobs. But those who were maybe in a different cadre of employment or in school may have been negatively impacted. And I think the ramifications will take some time to also get those accurate data, because I don't think we have a sure mechanism of measuring these Kenyans or diasporians who are in the US to get the actual numbers. But I also wanted to just make a quick comment, and this is perhaps towards both the World Bank as well as the Honorable PS Treasury. I've made this observation, and I've always wondered how it can be developed. Knowing how much remittances goes back to Kenya, and my strong belief that those remittances are mainly because of subsistence support, not necessarily in terms of investment, structured investments. And so therefore, would the PS and together with the World Bank come up with structured vehicles, structured modalities of investment vehicles, which would really tap into much more remittances, which would be more impactful. Because my thinking is, if with the amounts that are being remitted now, having such great impact, what would it be if we had structured vehicles that would allow remittances? Secondly, of course, I'm aware there is the Kenya-US bilateral trade agreement negotiations going on, and the hope is that they will be fruitful, which would also enhance the trade between Kenya and the US, larger than what it is now, perhaps limited within the confines of AGOA. The expectation, of course, being that with the expansion of the trade agreement, there will be much more impact. And so my reach out to the World Bank, because you guys have these smart people who can help to think through in how to enhance those relationships between Kenya and the US. Then we can rally the people, the diasporans, who would be engaged to do trade between Kenya and the US. I know I may have veered off from what you asked, Mr. Chacha. Forgive me. Like I said, this is I'm a novice when it comes to issues of economics, but I hope whatever I said may have made some little sense, and I can always do a follow-up if necessary. But thank you for the opportunity to speak, and if there's any question also, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Laban. I mean, those were great interventions, no doubt. And I think for your last question, probably I could defer to the PS if he's able to, is still with us, I believe, yeah. So PS, Dr. Julius Moya, Laban asks about, whether we could, I mean, the government as well as working together with development partners could put together a vehicle that is able to tap on some of these remittances and in a way provide an opportunity for more impactful investment. Because he underscores that most of these remittances does come to support, families back at home, but providing in such a vehicle would be very useful. So, so probably PS, you may intervene to provide what you have in government in terms of being able to tap this opportunity. And also, I think you can also comment on the Kenya-US FTA negotiations very briefly. PS, please.
Well, thank you, Chacha. And I've been following the presentations and really sincerely appreciate that they have been to the point. Yeah, the question posed by Laban Opande, the lawyer. First, we do appreciate the remittances that keep on coming to the country from the diaspora. And the idea of structured investment vehicles that would attract funds in a formal way is something that we are looking at between the National Treasury and the Central Bank, basically to make sure that we formalize and find a way in which that investment which diasporas make is captured and it is streamlined and aligned properly. So this is something that we will continue discussing. And I think in these COVID situations where countries are looking for every coin that can be found, this would be good in terms of attracting what I would call FDI for that matter. Now, going to the question about the trade negotiations that are going on between Kenya and the US, I want to report that these are going on very well. We have put together a team on our side in Kenya, which is fairly well experienced in terms of trade negotiations. And so far, we have had a very good report in terms of how far we've gone. We are taking advantage of technology, this virtual platform, but then we have to wait until our friends in the US wake up because of the different time zones. But I would say our negotiations actually do go up to about 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Kenya time, and they've been going on very well. So this is something that is very, very encouraging, and especially now that Kenya is working with the US on a lot of things so that we can grow and progress both trade, investments, and related activities together. I thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, PS, and for that intervention. Let me now ask Gerono to, in 1 or 2 minutes to to maybe comment on how the students, and I must add that, the students, I think globally, and I think in many countries, especially in Kenya as well, if you follow the presentation, education is one of the sectors which has been hit very hard and has subtracted a substantial amount of its usual very stable contribution to growth, for example, in Kenya. And as you may be aware, Kenya's schools were closed since March, and have started to reopen only gradually from October, and only starting with the candidates. So I think it's a central issue. So it would be nice to comment, but to know how the students in the diaspora have been impacted, which I think it also really applies to the students here in Kenya as well. Professor Cherono, please.
Good afternoon and good morning. This is morning in the US time. So thank you so much, Mr. Chacha, for giving me that opportunity. As you said, our students have been impacted. I am a university professor. I'm actually a department chairing one of the largest departments at one of the state universities in North Carolina. So this is part of my response. I see that every day, the challenges of the academic disruptions, the closures and all that. But in terms of the international students, here in the US, we have over 4,000 Kenyan students, international students here. They were greatly impacted because as soon as schools closed, everybody went home. So education was disrupted. Most of our students, actually all international students, did not qualify for financial aid in the US. So because the schools were closed, so all the jobs were closed, on campus jobs were closed. So that means they had no source of income. Also, when schools were closed, they were forced to go home. Some of them stayed on campus, so we had to scramble to find places, especially those self-sponsored students. So it was a hassle for them to get, they've lost their jobs on campus because everything closed. They have no housing. Of course, healthcare was another issue. So we saw a big disruption in terms of their lives was disrupted. The academics were disrupted. Some of them did not have the quality internet and the technology to really function and to do well online. And then, of course, with the experience, we like the face-to-face value. So that created a lot of increase in stress and anxiety, as you can imagine. You don't know where your next food is going to come from. You don't know where you're going to stay. So what we did as a community was and as the president, actually the president of the Kenya Scholars and Studies Association, as well as the founder and the CEO, the president of KESID, Kenya Students in Diaspora, we came together and we rallied our efforts together. We were able to raise money to support students who are in need of basic needs. You know, they needed rent, they needed food. So we were able to come together as a community to raise those emergency funds for the students. What we also did was we held monthly Zoom sessions on how to mitigate COVID, what are some of the challenges. And then with me working with different organizations such as the KCFA, we were able to get different contacts in different states who could house those students who needed a place to stay. So we rallied together as a Kenyan community to buy them basic needs, to get them places to stay, to provide counseling. We actually have a circle of care. We also created mentors. So we have a lot of mentors who are mentoring these students, who are supporting them to help them through the process. So we were in the process of doing that. Also, something that we were able to do was we were able to rally together our resources and ideas. And we came up with a list of schools in the US who actually allow international students to pay in-state. We have schools in North Carolina that actually, they call them the Promise, that allow students to pay extremely low. And because my organization is a nonprofit organization, 501, that is registered in the state of North Carolina, we're actually able to move some of the students who are in national state universities to come to community colleges. They wait for the economy to pick up, and that way they can pay in-state. So we're able to navigate, and I work very closely with an organization called 250 US COVID Fund, where we also raise funds to support families who are in need of, who lost jobs, who lost everything. So there was a big need, and that continues to be a need because, like I said, we close schools today, students are home, we have no idea up in January. So there continues to be a need for that. And my question to the PS is, we had extended and we have had several conversations with the ministry, with CS Matiang, and with HELP, because in 2017, 2016, President Uhuru extended the HELP loans to international students. That was there, but that has not been effected. That would be extremely helpful in the emergencies because our students are not able to access funds in the US or outside other countries, if they could be given that access so that in the event that they are stuck, then at least they have something to fall back to take some loans from that would cushion them until this COVID is over. So PS, we'd really appreciate if we can follow up with that or let us know. I know the embassy has been extremely helpful in helping us to see how that process has gone.
Sure. Thanks, Professor Gerono, for those quite great comments on how the students have been impacted and how you mobilized to ensure that at least they're able to, put food on the table and be able to still stay engaged. We are really, really grateful. I don't know whether PS, you would like to respond, and I will also call Vera to then start giving questions from the social media that we have received so far. PS, just quickly.
Thank you, Peter, and appreciate Professor Gerono Rotich for that submission, and also applaud her for the efforts in putting together and coordinating the efforts in helping students who are out there in the US. The issue about help loans being available to international students is something that I will not give an answer now. I would beg to be given time to engage with the Minister of Higher Education and also the institution that is in charge of help loans, that is HELP itself, so that I can provide a competent answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muya. I would like to now take this opportunity to ask a number of questions that have come in from our listeners via social media. The first question goes both to the World Bank, Alex and Utz, mainly Utz, and also to Dr. Muya. What is World Bank doing to ensure provision of water in areas like Western Kenya, where flooding has been a problem with internally displaced persons in camps? And the second question is a three-part question. What is the future outlook for the Kenya shilling in 2021? Is it a doomsday scene or not? The interbank market for the foreign currency has been destroyed, and what we see on screen is 109 shillings to the dollar as a rate. And actual today, the question is not very clearly stated, so I'll paraphrase here. So the listener is asking, the interbank market for the foreign currency has been destroyed, and what we see is 109 shillings to the dollar interbank rate. And some banks charging 112 shillings. What is the government doing about this? So this would be a question for you, Dr. Muya. And my third question here, looking at the COVID-19 impact on household funds, I view that the government's fiscal measures were geared towards the formal funds. Is this attributable to the informality of these funds? And are these lessons to target better and mitigate future emergencies? So I think this is a question for you, Utz. Maybe we can have those questions responded to first before we take another round of questions. So over to you, Dr. Muya, and then Utz and Alex. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. I'll take the questions as they have been asked. The first one is about water. And I want to say we have very many programs that have been funded in the water sector, and thanks to World Bank, where we have been looking at water from 2 points of view, where water is to be provided, and also where there is a problem of sanitation. We also look at projects and programs in that area so that people can have access to clean water, and make sure that they don't suffer as they engage in kind of like sourcing their water. Well, one of the big issues we have in Kenya is that a large part of Kenya is arid and semi-arid. And so when you have got challenges of floods in parts of Budalangi and also lower Tana River and around Garissa, then you juxtapose that against a situation where most parts of the country do not have the water anyway. Water is a big challenge, but I want to say that it is one of the programs areas that the World Bank has been supporting us a lot. And we continue to engage with various development partners to have very many programs in the water sector. So we haven't forgotten Western Kenya, and we haven't forgotten any part of this country, especially because water is important for life. Now, the question about the future of the Kenya shilling. First, let me say that the Kenya shilling floats. I mean, we do not have a controlled exchange. So we allow what we call in economics the rules of demand and supply to determine the exchange rate of the shilling. Now, lately, I think we are aware that the US dollar has been very strong. And so much as we have the advantage of reduced imports, which then means that the supply of the Kenya, I mean the demand for the Kenya shilling has benefited from the fact that we have had fewer imports. But the strengthening of the US dollar is one thing that we have had to deal with. And also in the production sector, we haven't been able to generate the exports that we were doing before, especially like the flower sector, where demand faltered in the countries where we normally sell our flowers to. The tourism sector that brings a lot of exchange earnings for the country have suffered. So going forward, we are looking to a situation where as now we implement the economic recovery strategy that we're talking about, we expect exports to improve. And at the same time as the exports improve, we expect the Kenya shilling to stabilize going forward. There was a third question that wasn't very clear, and I would request it to be repeated, please. Vera?
Okay, Dr. Muya, we'll come back to that question in a little while. I have 3 questions that have come here from Nation Africa. They largely are for you, Dr. Muya. The 3 questions. And Oots and Alex have not forgotten that you do need to intervene on the previous 2 questions. So perhaps we can do that very quickly, and then I can pivot to the questions from the media. So over to you, Oots and Alex.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Vera, and thank you so much to the audience for asking like these questions. I think these are like really good questions, and it is important to discuss those. And so I think the PS already has sort of like covered a big part on the question on flooding and the situation of Western Kenya. What I just wanted to add is that indeed it is really important to not forget other shocks while we are sort of like busy with COVID-19. And what comes to mind is obviously also locust. And I think in November, we are basically have expected, or like December, we're expecting a second wave of locust as well. And so there are multiple shocks affecting different parts of the population in different ways. And so generally, I think as a government, but of course also as the World Bank supporting the government, it is really important to keep these other shocks in mind and to like basically devise a good scheme of like how to go about them. And just let me like point out like 3 different points, what the way how we think about shocks. Like the first one is, and the best strategy is to create resilience. If you create resilience before a shock hits, it's a very opportune time to do that because you're not yet in the emergency, and it's usually much cheaper to intervene. Then when the shock comes, resilient households are not going to be as strongly affected. And that's exactly what you'd like to see, because obviously often shocks cannot be completely prevented. But if households are resilient, they can act much better in the face of a shock. Now, the second sort of component of the strategy is to mitigate the impact of the shock. So in this case, you're already in the emergency. and you see the shock, and you know that not all households are resilient or not sufficiently resilient, or maybe the shock was not, let's say, like as predicted. I mean, I think COVID-19 took the world quite a bit by surprise, especially with like specific date and the specific way how it happened. And so implementing mitigation measures is really important. Now, to do this, I also do think it is important, and I'd like to emphasize and highlight the data agenda that is behind there. The government needs to enact and derive policies and programs based on evidence, and evidence requires data. And so it is really important to have the proper data infrastructure in place. Like in Kenya, we were quite fortunate that we had a very close relationship with KMBS, and KMBS was able very quickly to conduct phone service to inform the government. But that's also something that can even be improved much better and much further. And that's something we actually would like to engage much more in. Now, the third component after sort of like building resilience, mitigating the impact, the last one obviously is recovery. So once the shock is gone, it is important to make sure and to like keep an eye on households that were affected by the shock to help them to recover. And here we come back to what I've repeated multiple times. The real importance is that if a household goes into poverty, that they do not remain there as like a poverty trap of which they don't get out anymore. And so therefore, like recovery measures are really important to ensure that this doesn't happen. Now, on the second question, gearing support formal firms versus informal firms. Let's say it like this. I mean, unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but like as a characteristic of a formal sector is that firms are registered, that firms go through like the formal procedures. This makes it much easier for government to intervene and to change some of the regulations because these firms have to adhere to them because they are formal. Now, for informal firms, it's just much more difficult to reach them and to target them. So while on the one side, yes, I do agree that it is important to have support also to informal firms, like to make this happen is just much more difficult. And I think this is why it's not surprising that quite a bit of support is much more targeted towards the formal firms. Let me stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Utz. Alex, did you want to come in, or would you like me to proceed with further questions?
Thanks so much. Yeah, no, just 30 seconds from me by way of, sorry, my video, by way of, echoing Utz's point on resilience and linking to some of the excellent questions and also seeing them on the chat. I mean, I do think, the whole question of, how do we think about building sources of resilience at the micro level, which Utz has spoken to, but also, on the macro is something we're all going to be thinking about much more in terms of, the lessons that come out of this crisis. And something that strikes me is, of course, there's a balance between adapting to the new conditions the crisis has created and being sort of nimble in that sense. But there's also the link to the ongoing and the medium-term agenda that that Kenya has, the vision that it has for continuing to develop its economy and achieve inclusive growth. And there's been a lot of ambition on that front. And actually the crisis, it just further elevates some of the aspects of this agenda. So if we think, for example, about Big Four, universal healthcare, well, it makes so clear that, really making progress on this is something in terms of continuing to build capacity and access to and the quality of service provision on health can make a major difference if we do see future pandemics and in terms of the human capital that the country has. That's just one example, but there are so many things around productivity and so on. And then, there's a question about how the country can sort of build this resilient recovery. And I think there's a real opportunity, if Kenya can sort of articulate that focus to come out of this, in a way that really sort of sets a good direction, to stand out, back towards those 5-6% growth rates, but more importantly, in a way that is really meaningful for the livelihoods of everyone in the kind of income pyramid. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Alex. And definitely that impact on human capital is one to watch. Keith, I do have a question for you coming in from Mr. Anthony Badi. With all the concern being raised on university education, with research/innovation being key, as shown by COVID, is the World Bank and the government of Kenya reviewing their financing mechanisms to put more funds in universities? So that's for you, Keith. But before I turn over to you, I would like to ask these 3 questions that have come in from the Nation Media Group for Dr. Muya. Please clarify when exactly the government will launch the credit guarantee scheme and how it will work. The second question, does the government still see the economy growing at 2.9% in 2020 with the latest numbers that are just in? And third, what taxes are being reversed in January or will be reversed in January, and which ones will remain? So over to you, Keith, and then we'll pivot back to the Principal Secretary. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that question. And it is indeed very important what is happening in universities and now more than ever with this crisis. The bank has for a long time actively supported higher tertiary specialized education. And in particular, we've recently ramped up a regional approach, working through centers of excellence that enable a number of countries to pool their resources together. It is often difficult for individual countries to build up institutions of higher learning with the depth required in every specialization. But working as a community, as in East Africa, for instance, it's possible for all countries to go further. So we have been working on this for a number of years, and these undertakings have had good results. And we also, of course, work with individual countries on their own university and other higher education systems. So this is not something new to us, something we've actively engaged in. And of course, this is important to build capacity across the board, not just in economic management, but all the other aspects of modern governance and economies. So it's definitely an area that's under continual discussion and is getting growing support from the bank around the world and in Africa.
Thank you very much, Keith. Dr. Muya, over to you.
Thank you. Let me deal with the 3 questions from the Nation. The question about the credit guarantee scheme. We have advanced in terms of the paperwork and also identifying the commercial banks that are going to participate in that credit guarantee scheme program. So once we are able to get the Attorney General to clear the agreements, we will launch the credit guarantee scheme promptly. I see that happening not later than Friday next week, if I can be specific. And this is a framework where we are looking to support MSMEs through the financial institutions to be able to grant credit to business people that they wouldn't have granted credit without the credit guarantee scheme facility. This happens actually in a small way. And so for us to now have the government put in 3 billion shillings as a facility, that will provide the guarantee for the commercial banks. It's a step in the right direction, and this is just the beginning. The question about the growth of the economy, I did mention that we are focusing and projecting that in the calendar year 2020, the growth will be 0.6%. I've seen my friends in the World Bank are focusing -1%. Again, the uncertainties around this time are so much such that it is actually a big task to predict and to estimate. So we hope we'll be able to hold in terms of the sectors that have shown resilience, like agriculture, and to a large extent we are seeing the energy sector recovering now, so that we can register some positive growth. So those are the numbers for what we are projecting. Now the questions about taxes in January being reversed, I want to emphasize that these are taxes that are being reversed because they are taxes that are kind of like adjusted downwards in April this year, and that was specifically to help businesses, to help Kenyans. And so the VAT that was adjusted downwards from 16%, 14%, we are reversing it back to 16%. But again, it is important to note that this is still the lowest in the region. The other countries in the region, their VAT rate is 18%. Then the corporation tax rate, the number, we are reversing the number from 25% to go back to 30%, just to reverse what was taken down in April this year. And then the pay as you earn, this is the highest income tax rate, which had been brought down from 30% to 25%. We'll take it back to 30%. And finally, the minimum tax for people who have an income of 24,000 shillings and less in a month, we are going to remove that clause that allows them not to pay any tax. So those are specifically the ones that we are reversing, and it's a reversal. It is not a new tax that is being imposed. And that, I believe, deals with the three questions that Vera I was going to deal with.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muya. Dear ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be running out of time. So at this point, I would like to turn over to our program leader, Alan Dennis, to make the closing remarks. Now, I do note, though, before Alan comes on board, that there are a number of questions in the chat function that we have not gotten to. And we also had one diaspora speaker, Professor Owiso, who was supposed to make an intervention. To you all, on behalf of the World Bank, I truly do apologize. We will endeavor to note your questions, and we've done that already. We will get back to you in written form, or we will make time for our panelists to have a short discussion with you. Thank you very much for your understanding. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Vera. So I have a very simple task, and first and foremost, may I extend our sincere appreciation to Dr. Julius Muya, PS National Treasury, for taking the time to be our chief guest here and staying throughout the entire program. So really sincere appreciation, and also taking a lot of very difficult questions, but which he handled very, very well and enriching this discussion. So thank you, Bwana PS. And I also want to thank our guests from the diaspora. This is the first time, I believe, that we've had a KU launch involving the diaspora. So KU is clearly flying with wings. KQ wings over to the US, and hopefully next time around we'll have Dubai and Norway, because I know Kenyans are all over, not only in the US. So thank you so much, Lawyer Opande, as well as Professor Rotich, and our guest who was not able to speak, but all the same, we do appreciate that you took the time to be here. And of course, this event would not have been an event without all of you who are connected. As you know, there's this African proverb that says that, if you want to go fast, you can go alone, but if you really want to go far, you have to go with many. I mean, Utz, Alex, and Peter, who have led this report, excellent report, have been on their own, but they knew that the ideas are not only housed in their minds, but they need to bring it to the table, which the KU seeks to do, to stimulate a discussion, which this one certainly has not failed to do. And we've gotten a lot of really good ideas and a good discussion going on. And thanks to Vera and her team, the communication team, I know that the discussion is not yet over and that it will be continuing in the social media space. So please, stay tuned. I'm sure Vera will give us all the contacts so that we can keep the discussion continue to pepper our authors, Alex, Peter, and Utz, with more questions. We promise that we will. Of course, would like to even do it here, but we couldn't take everything. But that doesn't mean we are out of sight. We want to continue this discussion. It's good for us as the World Bank to hear from you. It sharpens our ideas, as they say, iron sharpens iron. So please channel all your questions through Vera, and we'll be more than happy to continue to engage with you. Let me just wrap this up and say, I know it's been somewhat of a somber discussion, not surprising because of the times that we find ourselves in. And that's also reflected even in the questions that have been posed. We're worried about what's going to be the growth, when is the liquidity to the, MSMEs going to come through? What are the external risks? And, all kinds of, when is fiscal consolidation, coming back on track, and all kinds. So it's really, really been a very, very, very somber discussion, understandably so. But I don't seek to continue in that somber mood. I'd like to put a little bit of ray of hope, just to say that I believe that in every crisis, there also is an opportunity. And actually, in this presentation, I heard the word, encouragingly, I heard the word opportunity a few times, which at least sort of balanced things out a little bit. And just to say that, yes, it definitely is a trying and difficult time, but there are also opportunities even in this difficult situation. So let's look at how together, again, as Africans and wanting to go far, how we can build Kenya better. The World Bank doing what it can do, but obviously the greater part of the work is with the people of Kenya, first and foremost, and then the government later on, and then others can come in. But it is the people of Kenya who essentially will build this country back with the support of the government and friends of Kenya. I mean, there are opportunities as supply chains are being disrupted globally. People are talking about domestic value chains and regional value chains. There are opportunities to leapfrog in terms of the digital agenda, especially with all this physical contact being more and more limited. They say necessity is the mother of inventions. So I know Kenyans are a creative lot. I mean, they're the ones who created M-Pesa how many decades ago, and now it's become a thing that is common. So as we're looking at this, let's also look at the opportunities that this COVID crisis has in it, and how overcoming them, all of us together in your small space, can help this country build back better. So with that positive note, in a very somber environment, I'd like to say final thanks to everyone. Over to you, Vera. Bye.
Thank you very much, Alan. And definitely, when we work and walk together, we go farther. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our broadcast. Thank you all for making the time to join us. Please remember to follow us and continue the conversation on Twitter at World Bank Kenya. Have a great evening and good morning for those joining us from the United States. Bye now.